This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's Weekly Dispatches series. For the past month, thousands of farmers in Punjab have been protesting in response to the BJP government's rushed passing of three controversial farm bills. At stake is the food security and the food supply of over a billion Indians. Joining us today to discuss the protest and place it in the larger history of reform and resistance are Professor Navyug Gill and activist and author Ajaypal Singh Brar. Navyug Gill is an assistant professor in the Department of History at William Paterson University. His research lies at the intersection of agrarian political economy, labor history, postcolonial critique, and comparative histories of global capital. He is currently completing his book manuscript titled Labor of Division, Caste, Capital, and Emergence of Peasants in Colonial Punjab. Ajaypal Singh Brar is one of the five-member committee of farmer protests being held in Shambu in Punjab. His protest supports other protests across the state by farmer unions, but differ as it seeks federal structure of governance. He's a political activist, author, and commentator. Thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to be part of the program. Thank you.
For the past month, and I want to put the first question to you, Navyug. For the past month, thousands have taken to the street in protests in Punjab, Haryana, and other states. And before we discuss the protests, can you tell us about the BJP government's hurried passing of the controversial farm bill, what it is?
Sure, absolutely. First, thank you, Suchitra, and the rest of your team, Vishali and Harman, and everybody else at the Polis Project. You guys are doing amazing work, especially at a moment like this. The controversy and the protests in Punjab have actually been going on for the past few months. And they're in response to these three bills, as you mentioned, that were passed last month, which were designed to sort of transform procurement policies in the agrarian economy. The stated claim of the BJP government is that these bills are designed to cut out intermediaries, introduce freedom and choice, and overall raise incomes of farmers. But what they actually do is of procurement that we have. The three bills, the main bill, the first one is designed to deregulate the procurement network as it exists. So what happened in the 1950s and 60s, a kind of system of government-regulated markets were established where farmers could sell their harvest at minimum support prices. And that system continued in the 60s and 70s through the Green Revolution and into the 80s and 90s with adjustments throughout. Now, the existing system before had, its own kind of shortcomings. There were problems in deciding what the minimum support prices for crops was. There was backlogs, some delays, but by and large, that was how sort of agricultural procurement was organized. What this bill does is allow for a parallel system of private markets to be set up alongside the public markets. And so the language the BJP is using is that it will give farmers the choice to sell their products, their harvest in the private system or in the public system. What it will actually do is undercut the public system and create more volatility and precariousness. And farmers have been aware of this. And so they've mobilized for months and are challenging these bills on the streets in Punjab and Haryana and elsewhere.
Mr. Singh, would you like to add to this question?
The process of privatization of the markets or opening up of the farm market was it was there already going on, and in 2003 the Ajaypal government had already given a model bill, because agriculture being a state subject, they had already given a model bill, and most of these laws were somehow already there. But about 6% of the farmers, that is in Punjab, Haryana, and some parts of Rajasthan, were being offered the MSP on two particular the MSP was there on about 23 commodities, but out of this, 2 were being bought by the government as a guaranteed purchase, largely due to the food security reasons as well as some political reasons in this region. And in the times of the COVID, taking the advantage of that, BJP government, the present BJP government pushed through certain ordinances. It was not only related to agriculture; they pushed around some ordinances related to labor, etc. also. And when these ordinances came in, there was largely not many protests, because either reasons were either due to COVID or the farmers were still not very clear about what is going to happen. But moment these were about to be made law, the protests started erupting. So the hurry, what you asked about, that why they hurried through it, was probably that wanted to take advantage of the COVID scenario and push through these through the ordinances. These laws were pushed through the ordinances.
And that brings us to the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill will also affect the food security of over 1 billion Indians. What measures will the new laws put in place, and how will they dismantle some of the essential safeguards in the existing system?
As far as these bills are concerned, India has good amount of reserves as of today, and wheat and is already being produced in large surplus. So even if as far as the government is concerned and the consumers are concerned, unless there is no large scale hoarding, there's not likely to be much impact on the wheat supplies to the common people. If you look at it, the past of this, actually it was in 1965 or 66 that these laws came, this push came into being, when India was facing food shortages. The American government helped in India to get into the hybrid varieties and green revolution, so that if they have a food security, the process of communism coming in, or the communist forces taking roots in this region would be stifled or would stop. And it did have an effect, and green revolution did contribute to food security of this region, and also to the prosperity in Punjab. But it had other impacts, like we saw mass migration, we saw a lot of materialism coming into society, a lot of the soil got overexploited, the water resources got overexploited. So in a way, what was a normal prior to these laws was also not something which was very good, which was not Punjab centric or not good for this people. But these laws are even going to be much more harmful to us. But as far as the food security is concerned, in wheat, India is producing surplus. Not only in this region, even Madhya Pradesh has taken, and there's enough land, and there's not likely to be any food security issues related to wheat. Paddy, yes, it's just on the balance, but the government still have the MSP regime, and for some time it can still continue to buy on MSP. So you see, the government has come out with parallel kind of a structure, that the transition part can be taken over. But definitely, once these get passed on to the private sector, what a consumer can fear is that we might not be able to get the good quality part. It might get exported, or might be hoarded or something like that. But that's still far away.
Yeah, and I would add, I think in a larger context, we should see this as a deeply ideological project. And it's an ideological project shared by the BJP and the Congress. What this will do, in effect, is remove the government from its role in agricultural production. And we see the government kind of withdrawing from it and throwing the country's food supply to market forces. And that is not a kind of neutral or natural process. That's one designed with kind of specific outcomes. And it will produce the most precarious, volatile situation, because private players will have a sort of free hand in procuring and selling and distributing food, whereas the government had a role in this. And by the government having a role, there was all sorts of subsidies and protections and benefits that they were able to distribute through that network. When this entire system becomes privatized, the government will be removed from that. So even if there will be the availability of grain, the prices will be dictated by private players. And in that sense, it's a global phenomenon. We see this kind of taking place in all sorts of, all parts of the world, where the language of choice and freedom and efficiency is used to bring about this kind of neoliberal market logic. And its proponents accuse people who oppose it as being backward and old-fashioned and protectionist, when in fact what they're trying to do is, harken back to the 18th century. And they're really actually kind of antiquarian, because they want the most sort of vicious free market system to prevail.
Navyug, I kind of want to, I have a follow-up for you.
Uh-huh.
In the recent Outlook essay that you wrote, you also you talk about, there's a very interesting paragraph where you talk about creation of these artificial choices, and you also use the American charter school system to describe it. I think that's a very interesting comparison. Can you quickly walk us through that?
Yeah, I think that the it's the way the kind of the abuse of language almost, right? It's a kind of deployment of certain euphemisms to kind of shape one's understanding of a situation. So here, what you have in the US is this language of choice and efficiency and freedom. And it was related to the school system. So people would decry the fact that public schools are terrible, and repeat this over and over and over again. And so then the solution to terrible public schools, these proponents would say, was let's create these things called charter schools, which is privatized schools. And they will be much better and more efficient. And we'll keep the public schools, but we'll have these charter schools. And then parents will be empowered to choose where to send their child. And what you've seen in so many school districts is, you sort of have this rush to charter schools. And as students enroll, the dollar amounts the state allocates go with the child. And then the public system's funding goes down, and those schools become worse and worse. And therefore, it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So what they're trying to do in India is similar. Say that the Mandi system, or say that the MSP system is outdated and outmoded and inefficient, and we'll create this sort of private arena where things will be more efficient and will allow both to exist. But as everyone knows, that public system will slowly enervate and weaken and then collapse. And then everybody will be left at the whim of the private system. The challenge is public schools can be fixed. You don't have to create charter schools in order to fix public schools. And those solutions are what the proponents here don't want to pursue. And similarly in India, the Mandi system, the MSP system, the entire agrarian economy can be reorganized. But what they're trying to do is actually take it in a very regressive, conservative, despotic direction.
So we know who was going to be direly affected by it. So who benefits from the new reform in the Farms Bill? Who is going to benefit from the reforms that have made?
As far as benefit is concerned, if you look at these three laws, like any neoliberal policy, the main beneficiaries are likely to be the corporates, and they will have they had already started building that infrastructure, and in Punjab you have already seen silos being built by them and train lines being put. So essentially, the big corporates are the first beneficiaries, as they are going to take on the food chain, the food production. At least they will be the ones who will be controlling all the food, entire food chain from farm to fork. Kind of concepts are coming up. So the primary beneficiaries are the corporates. Apart from that, the political parties, some of them might benefit or not, but the small farmers are not going to benefit. Some small farmer is the one who is going to hit the most. And especially in Punjab and in Haryana, they are going to take on the hit. But as far as I see, the only beneficiaries out of the whole system, whole process is going to be the corporates. And in case they are able to bring in efficiency, I don't know. I mean, that is questionable. But as far as as far as I can have a look at it, it's the big corporates going to benefit at the cost of small farmers, at the cost of small artias, at the cost of consumers.
Yeah, and I would just add, in addition to large corporations benefiting because they will take over the procurement and distribution network, you have to understand that large corporations are not going to be interested in contracting with every farmer and buying going to every mandi and getting all the grain in all of the towns and villages across the country. It won't be worth their time. So what will actually end up happening is you'll have cartels forming in different localities, where large landlords, 100, 150, 200 acres, will together and with large traders control procurement in their area, and then will contract directly with the corporations. So again, the ideological kind of fantasy scenario they paint is that an individual farmer sitting in, say, Bathinda can see that their crop actually gets a better rate in Maharashtra, so they'll decide maybe I'll sell it in Maharashtra, or I'll sell some of it in Bengal. This is a fantasy. This is ridiculous. It will never happen. The storage facilities, the transportation, all of that is not available to somebody cultivating 5 or 4, 3 acres of land. So what will happen is they take their produce to the market, and if the existing government mandi system that has a minimum support price is no longer existing, it will be the large landlords that control procurement in that area de facto who will say, here's the price that we're going to give you. If not, tough luck. Nobody's going to buy your crop. And so they will gather up all of the harvest in their area, and then they will sell it to the corporations. So cartels and corporations, I see it as the sort of main beneficiaries of this, to the detriment of everyone else.
I want to now go to what's happening on the ground. Can you walk us through the recent protests and the tactics that are being used? How are the farmers organizing and thinking long term? But as you answer this question, I would also like to place these protests in the longer history, and how these protests are not just instantaneous, but have been it's kind of a much longer history to these protests.
If you look at these protests, the protests initially started with some articles in the newspapers, and then the Kisan unions or the farmer unions got the cue of it, and they started protesting against it. Farmer unions are generally their domain skill lies in incremental kind of bargaining, or they would bargain on purely financial terms. And these farm unions took birth in 1972, when prior to that the Green Revolution came in, and the farmer would actually it used to be a contract between the farmer and the government on a broader way. The MSP was a contract between them, so where the farmer would produce and the government would buy. So at that point of time, these trade unions sprouted. And initially it was one, and then they split up into one another. And most of them have a Marxist leaning, and they were the kind of organizations that were needed for these protests. They were adept at it. They had those domain skills, and they were doing a pretty well job. They would protest and get some increments, and then at some times those increments would not come. Sometimes those would come if there were other problems like pestilence or pesticide problems or certain kind of thing. They could take on small issues and fight over it. Generally a trade union kind of protest. But lately, what we have seen is that this is the one challenge which they cannot take on. They neither have the resources nor have the organizational skills, nor do they have a leadership, because this is more of a political problem. That is, though they are fighting over it, they are pretty. I mean, they really fear the situation, and they don't have a tactics, or they don't have a strategy, a long-term strategy to fight it out. They thought probably if they come out and protest, and like in past, they might get some concession, they will be able to withdraw. That is where our form of protest differ from them. we at Shambu have gone ahead and said that this is not merely a problem of MSP, because if we go back, if all these laws are nullified too, and we go back to the older model, that was also not a normal model. The normal which they're talking was not a normal one. We were seeing suicides. We were seeing people leaving this place, and youth exodus from from Punjab. So we came up with a different narrative that this is not an MSP problem. It is more of a political problem and has to be addressed in a very different way. The root lies in the central-state relationship, whereby we in Punjab should have a right to make decisions and able to create a Punjab-centric model for agriculture. It is only when such a model has been created that we can have a sustainable agriculture which takes into account the ecology and as well as the financial aspects, whereas the trade unions are today fighting only in the financial aspect. Today they have got themselves into a blind alley, and as government is not ready to budge, it is not even going to ready to give any concessions there. So the trade, they don't have any strategy. It's day-to-day tactics that they are following, and government has recently, yesterday only, announced another draconian kind of a law that if you burn the stubble, the paddy stubble, you might be fined up to 1 crore and 5 years of imprisonment. That has put additional pressure on them. On the other hand, now there are another set of people like us who are sprouting, small protests sprouting up across Punjab, who talk in the sense in the same narrative as we had started talking about at Shambu. That is that this problem has to be addressed in through a political process. It needs a political organization to take on these protests. So as of today, nobody has a long-term perspective. Only thing that we have realized lately is that it's going to be a very, very long drawn-out struggle, and it is not going to be easy. It might be very traumatic way the center government and its hubris is acting, and we are likely to, but definitely we will see organizations sprouting up or new kind of fronts coming up. Even at Shambu, we are trying to cobble up a front of a number of political, well-meaning political people so that they can take on this challenge.
We already have
Yeah.
quite a few audience questions coming in. I'll just have.
Okay. Should I quickly just add?
Sure. I just have a follow-up question to this. Can I have the question
Sure.
and then you can respond to the? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So the only follow-up question that I have for this is that this is no longer just the farmers' protest. Correct me if I'm wrong. There seems to be an overwhelming support from all walks of the Punjabi society. First, I want to make sure that that's a correct reading of the situation, and if so, if you could kind of talk about why this is no longer just a farmers' protest, but is becoming something else.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I think to build on that, one, I think that this government especially, but in a sense all governments, give the veneer of being steadfast and not budging and not giving an inch until they do, until popular pressure compels them to do so. So reading into the kind of rigidity of the government, I think it always sort of looks the same until it doesn't. As you just mentioned, Suchitra, massive public support, I think, has kind of transformed this question and reveals the popular disgust with the BJP government and the fact that everyday people in Punjab and Haryana know what this will do. There is a kind of awareness of the implications of these laws and these changes, and they've mobilized sort of across the spectrum to come out in favor of the protesters and all of the kind of different measures that are going on. And Brar Sahab knows the kind of internal tensions with the Kisan unions and the Khet Mazdoor unions and the kind of caste politics. And so that is all present on the ground. But we would say that those kinds of tensions are present in any mass mobilization. And I can't recall a time in the last 20 or 30 years when there has been such a outpouring of popular support for such kind of challenges to the government. The last thing I'll say is that the other thing that's heartening is the fact that all of the attempts by the existing political parties to co-opt the protests have largely failed. You see the kind of drama of the Shromani Akali Dal leaving the NDA and claiming that they're opposing these bills. Captain Amrinder Singh's government, the Congress, has tried to kind of say we're also opposing it. They had this show of a tractor rally with Rahul Gandhi. Even the Aam Aadmi Party has given its support to the protests. But nobody is fooled that all of these parties are implicated in this mess. When they were in power, they did the exact same thing or didn't do anything to alleviate the crisis in the agrarian economy. And it is not a Congress or an Akali Dal or a BJP-led movement. It is a kind of popular mass-based opposition.
So we have audience questions coming in. So I'm going to place the first one. This is from Akhtar, who says, such a good conversation to be having. And this question is for you, Navyug. It says, what other language do you suggest we can invoke in response to one of freedom and choice that the dominant parties are invoking?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think first it's to name the fact that their language is itself an abuse and it's a euphemism. We should name the problem as a deeply ideological, zealous commitment to market logic. This is a kind of real bizarre, warped, fringe commitment to the market. And it's been discredited sort of across the world, yet its adherents hold fast to it. And we should name it as kind of almost fanatical capitalism. And that's, one of the examples is that agriculture, nowhere else in the world is practiced like this. The government, in Canada and America, throughout Europe, is deeply invested in soybean and cotton and corn and wheat, with the best infrastructure, with the best storage facilities and transportation. There are still subsidies and protections. So what can that possibly mean in a country like India when you remove the government from it? So I think we named the what they're trying to do as a very warped ideological project. It is an antiquarian project. It itself is outdated and discredited because they want to go back to the 19th and 18th century. It's a bit, to give another parallel, like the so-called gig economy, what companies like Uber and Lyft have done, use that language of freedom and choice, but actually they want to go back to complete savage capitalism, where people are desperately trying to kind of stay one step ahead of absolute destitution and poverty. So I think that reframing of it, and then through the struggle of reframing, coming up with a new vocabulary is central to challenging this global logic.
We have another question. This one says, if the farmers' bill is so damaging to the farmers, why is the current regime so adamant about it?
I would like to add up that if you look at the protests, these protests are do not find much traction in the larger part of India. You find these protests, these strong protests in Punjab and some parts of Haryana only. So as he has said that why is government adamant? Because these laws were already, this kind of structure was already in place. Rather worse one was in place in other places like Bihar did not have the mandi system, and government was not buying at MSP, and the farmers were on the mercy of the small trading sharks. So for them, it is not likely to be of much impact. Rather, they might be looking at it in a positive way. On the other hand, in Punjab, the protests are not, as you said, that we are getting people from all walks of life. And if you really look at the kind of people coming in, if it's only about 25-30% of the actual farmers coming in. The rest of the crowds or rest of the participants are the ones who are partially dependent on agriculture, or their parents were dependent on agriculture, and they have other sources of income too. So if you look at the protests in Punjab, it is a manifestation of something else. It is just that the farm bill was a trigger for those protests. In recent past, there was COVID harassment of people. It was ruthlessly people were pushed back into their homes. Then we had issues like in Shromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee was being mismanaged. That was also building up. So people were actually disgruntled about the whole system as such. And what we are seeing through these protests is the manifestation of that frustration or that desperation coming out in form of the farm protest, because it is a much broader appeal. So that is where the Punjab differs from the rest of the country, and government can get away with passing these laws across the country, but in Punjab and parts of Haryana, they are facing these issues.
We have another audience question. This says, India has been involved in heightened border disturbances. How does it affect the internal issues, including farmers' protests? This is an interesting question that keeps coming up because a lot of draconian measures, not only the recent ones, have often been justified in the name that Punjab is a border state. I would so would either of you like to take this question?
Yeah, it's in either way. I mean, then Punjab, India is seeing a stress on the Chinese border, and you have a heightened activity from Pakistan, and Kashmir is already in turmoil, and the government, a lot of forces are involved there. Punjab has a lot of significance, or a lot of. I mean, we have to really look at these protests in Punjab with a critical eye. There are chances of it getting into a very different kind of taking a different trajectory. We already see a lot of action on that front, and even at our protest where we talk about autonomy and what we term as khud mukhtari here, these are generally taken as cues towards seeking sovereignty or seeking independence or separatism. So the people or the leaders here, as well as the central government, has to watch out that we have to tread a very, very thin line. And the way the central government or the Modi government has taken, in its all arrogance, is building up the pressure. It's really very becoming day and by day. It's becoming even difficult for the state government as well as the parties here and the protesters here to keep the youngsters or keep the people away from that sovereignty issue, because irrespective of all things, the youth today understands that there are issues across at the geopolitical level, and they feel that they are being oppressed, be it farm issues, be it other things. Today they feel oppressed, and definitely the central government does have those draconian laws in place for Punjab specifically. I mean, the police is hyperactive, and for same kind of act, a person would be let off in Madhya Pradesh, but would face a very, very tough sentence as far as Punjab is concerned. So it is today on the onus of it's the onus of the central government, as the agencies here, as well as the leadership of these protests, to keep the people off that separatism kind of line, and some action needs to be taken on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add, I think there's two sides to this kind of an issue, maybe uniquely in this case. One is, this is an old tactic of governments to sort of put an emphasis or even manufacture kind of tensions at the border. In India's case, the China situation, but always the eye is to Pakistan, and kind of fomenting kind of tensions and sort of claiming attacks and conspiracies, and usually using that external threat to kind of gather everybody to support the government. So that's an old tactic, and I think the difference in this case is that from what I've heard from relatives and people on the ground too, is that in Punjab, the response is, you're asking us to go and fight and die on a border, and you want to immiserate and starve us here, right? They're kind of exposing the bankruptcy of that. That what is this, you want Punjabis to be recruited into the military, you want us to use us in this kind of heroic, sword arm fight to the enemies, but these policies are going to impoverish vast numbers of people in Punjab. It's a kind of destruction of the entire agrarian economy. And so I don't think those things, the claim of kind of external threats is very convincing.
I kind of want to go back to one of the issues that I wanted to discuss is looking at the 1978 Anandpur Sahib resolution. Again, this has been covered very differently by the Indian mainstream. I was wondering if we could talk about what this resolution is and why this resolution becomes important today in terms of many of the conversations around federalism and how to approach the crisis.
Uh, if you look at the Anandpur Sahib resolution, actually it was in 1972 that the Anandpur Sahib resolution came into being, and it has, if you go through it, it is not a not a it has about three parts, and they do not actually fit into it properly, and one can find that they have been authored by different men or different minds set altogether. 1972 one was largely which focused on Sikh identity as such and talked about Khalsa Ji ke bol bale in this region. In 78, it was watered down, and we can call it Ludhiana Declaration, which talked more about central state relationships and certain advantage, certain financial aid and certain economic advantages to state of Punjab. Today, moment these laws came in, and other more lot of other centralization activities which the state government which the center carried on, a lot of centralization was being pushed through. The Anandpur Sahib resolution or talk of it has started gaining traction. But when you talk in private to the people, generally the name is, the leadership of various morchas or the activists or even political party, all political parties are largely talking about the same thing, but they shun away from the name of it as an Anandpur Sahib resolution. They are ready to talk about it. They are ready to talk. They want to talk about central state relationship of a federal India and a democratic Punjab. Somewhat would call it a federal India, more leverage or more power in regional authority index, more powers to state. And that has become that is today, we can say a buzzword amongst all political parties, be it Congress, be it Akalis, and be it small time leaders, as well as these morchas, or even now, even in trade Kisan Union lectures, one sees, one finds that the youth which is lecturing talks about these. And Anandpur Sahib resolution is more of a symbolic. They talk about it because it was the first time that such a document was produced. So its reference comes again and again. But at the same time, everyone is cautious about it because it was so maligned by the center as being separatist, though there was nothing like that in it. So they talk about Anandpur Sahib resolution or the 78 declaration, as I would see, but they would like to have it renamed and re-put and with something like same old thing in a new bottle, which is more secular in outlook and more inclusive for all Punjabis out there.
Yeah. I would add, I think, something like the Anandpur Sahib resolution, in all of its manifestations, as Brar Sahib explained, it actually opens up a very uncomfortable conversation about the nature of so-called Indian democracy. We have to understand that this was a document produced 1972, 73, and then 78, at a time when there was no BJP, right? This is a time when, 20, 30 years after independence, you have the rule of the Congress Party and one family within the Congress Party governing the country. And all of the promises and aspirations of independence had failed to deliver for places like Punjab. And so this document is a challenge to the Congress Party's vision of India. It's a challenge to that strong central control and the crushing of any form of dissent across the country. The Congress Party undermined and sabotaged all sorts of regional governments, every aspiration for autonomy, every critique of centralized structures was bought off, thrown in jail, and scuttled one way or another. And so this document comes at a time when there's an articulation of a new way to have a federal structure in India. And it's immediately labeled secessionist, and it's the Congress campaign for 30, 40 years to deride and denounce this document and delegitimize it. And so that's where it kind of now reappears, and people are kind of affirming it and saying, let's look back and see what were people saying in the 70s about the structure of the Indian government, about federalism, about states' rights, about autonomy. And in that sense, if you look at it closely, it's not a blueprint. It's not a kind of hard, it's got, this kind of structure, but it might be more useful to see it as a challenge and as an invitation to a different kind of imagination. And how people relate to it tells you a lot about how they think of so-called Indian democracy more than the document itself.
We have a question from, we actually have a question from Texas, from a law student who interned with a legal aid organization. And Jessica writes that Jessica used to intern with a law firm that helped a group of young men from Punjab who left Punjab and then traveled to Mexico and then crossed into the United States through the Mexican border. And she says through her limited interactions with these young men who were leaving, she heard horror stories of how Punjab itself was being turned away and remade. She wants to know if you can comment upon the recent increase in the exodus of men, especially from Punjab and Haryana, leaving India and then flying to Mexico and then crossing the southern border, and how what's happening in one part of the world is having dire effects to people otherwise. I know this is a very complicated question, but again, Jessica, thank you for writing in and flagging this.
See, migration from Punjab is not a new phenomena. It has been in past also. Punjab has been a source of military labor market across the world since almost since 18th century, and it continued with the British colonization. Also, there was migration, but lately, post 84. The youth in Punjab sees no future, fears that the justice is not going to there. They fear that they are in a blind alley, and along with it, there are dwindling farm incomes. The aspirational levels are high. And at the same time, there is a scope. I mean, there's a need for people on the other part of the world. The Western society needs human resource. So you see this these people traveling. I mean, people trying to move to the better and economically better environment or places. But there are a lot of push factors in Punjab, and on the other hand, there's a lot of pull factors in the Western Hemisphere, like say in countries like Canada, US, or Australia, which is today in need of human resources. So, and Punjab does have a quality human resource, which is physically tough, industrious, as well as, I mean, can adapt to any kind of places and suitably contribute to productively to those economies. So that is one reason. Materialism is also one of the reasons why people are ready to take this risk. But on the other hand, the push factors here is that one is not very confident of any kind of meaningful employment. And with drug cartels and mafias and wrong ways, the only method to make money, and at people being at mercy of those greed and favoritism pyramids, they are ready to take on those kind of risks, where even the life is threatened. I mean, crossing from Mexico into US is no small deal. I mean, it's like crossing a minefield. So if you get through alive, probably you have a good life. If you don't, the environment back home is also not good enough.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would add that it also throws up kind of larger questions, which is if people are so desperate, if people are so hopeless, if the situation is so bleak at home, and people are having to undergo these kinds of journeys to cross such a perilous border, what is the point of the state? What does it mean to have a country that can't ensure the well-being of its own population, that people are trying to flee so badly? Every once in a while in this country, you get these images of, the Berlin Wall, and people trying to cross the Berlin Wall from East Germany to West Germany, and they're always accompanied by accounts of how terrible it was in East Germany, and everybody's looking to come, the freedom of West Germany. Fine, that's its own kind of conversation about Cold War politics and the Soviet Union and the US. But if you have people, thousands and tens of thousands, trying to flee those countries, country like India, and come here, and yet the government wants to boast about satellites and missiles and all these other sort of building statues and building temples, and your own population seeks to flee, I think it then should make us kind of reconsider what the state has done for its people and what is the basis of its legitimacy if people are driven to such measures.
We're at the 45-minute mark, so I have a question. I have a question very similar to the concluding question that I had. This is from Sukmandami, and he asks, what would be some of the features of sustainable agricultural economy in Punjab? But along with that question, I want to put this last question to both of you, is that while the current protests are challenging the existing farm bill, do you believe that a return to status quo is possible or even viable? Because fighting to return to the status quo cannot be the solution now. So how do you see this turning out in terms of the future, and what do you expect as these protests play out?
Well, it's very unlikely that we are going to return to the status quo with the government taking a very hardened stand. And even if we return to status quo, the situation was that normal, as I said, was not a good normal, and the situation was not good. We had these migration, as we had just talked about, was people trying to run away from that status quo. In Punjab, we have seen in past as well that whenever there's such a deadlock, with the government, the protests take a form of a struggle, which is for greater autonomy or greater powers to the state. So the protests are likely to spread around to all sections of the society. And the challenge to the people who are protesting, as I had earlier said, was to turn this into a political protest and keep it non-violent. Because in such a scenario, the state tries to turn it into violence, because if there are incidents of violence, it's easier to snub this or curb these protests. So the challenge is to keep these non-violent and continue with these protests and be ready for a long, drawn-out political protest, and on all fronts. And that's the situation as of now. Nobody can visualize, nobody can strategize, or it's going to be transactional day-to-day tactics which are going to work. But definitely a long-term target can be in sight, that we need a Punjab-centric model, a model which is more based on ecology and most based on, there should not be an overexploitation of land resources. And at the same time, we should be ready for a dramatic and a big, long, drawn-out struggle.
Yeah, I agree completely. I would say that we, I think, encounter this question in different forms in I think societies across the world, where again we're given this false choice between sort of efficiency, productivity, output, and fairness, equity, sustainability. And I think our present moment, we've exposed the fact that this is a false choice, and that one doesn't have to pick either a viable and just economy or something that's profitable and successful. It's a similar kind of, it's analogous to the issue of, say, something like famines. Usually people understand famines occurring because of a lack of food. And what we've learned in the last sort of 100 or 200 years of writing and thinking on this is that famines don't occur because of a lack of food. They occur because of a lack of entitlement. There's actually an abundance of food. But now people starve because there's too much. And so the question becomes, who has access and rights and claims to the food, not its absence. So here, again, with the possibilities for reorganizing Punjab's agrarian economy, there are solutions. There are all sorts of possibilities out there. People have raised things like large-scale cooperative farming, more intensive cultivation, getting away from crops that deplete the water table and poison the environment, and those can be profitable and sustainable at the same time, combined with the program for industrialization and transforming sort of employment possibilities. In our present moment, we have the means to transcend that tension. And the tragedy is we keep circulating in that pendulum. Maybe 300 or 400 years ago, it was a different scenario. But today we can, and I think it'll be struggles like this that will shape what happens in the future. It will be born of a political struggle, and I think nothing else.
Thank you so much. I just have one last question that just arrived via email, if both of you have the time to answer it, and then we can close for today. The question comes from Berlin and says, I left India almost 40 years ago, and the news coming from India now seems less and less untrustworthy. For someone like me who is Indian but who stays far away, could you both suggest sources of information that one can rely on to get the right and the most factual information?
As for anything which doesn't go through with the government policy, the mainstream media is almost. I mean, it's almost debunked, and it's not of any use. Probably a person can rely on the social media platforms and also on YouTube channels. There also one has to pick and choose and see that they are not biased. So one has to pick up information from here and there. For example, farm protests are not being covered by any mainstream media today. Rather, RIA and those kind of tabloid. It's more of a tabloid press today. So that's one source of income I can suggest, of information I can suggest, that YouTube channels and some social media platforms. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, first, obviously, I would say the Polis Project and ventures like this that create platforms for conversations, sustained, thoughtful conversations on the difficult issues. But I have a little romantic about this. I think we actually should read everything under the sun. You got to read all of it, and you have to read it to know what these reactionary right-wing conservatives are thinking. But also that even if you read something else, the whole point is it's not just a matter of reading it, getting the information. There's something about intuition. There's something about the sociality of knowledge. Who are you speaking to afterwards? What are the kind of conversations you're having with your friends and family and others? So, one can suggest this or that news source or this and that author that might be a bit better or a lot better. But after you read that, who do you talk to? What do you think about? And then what do you end up doing? I think that has to be folded in with the question of access.
Thank you both so much for joining us for this conversation today. This conversation will be available on our YouTube channel for those who want to watch it. Again, it was Vaishali Patra who produced the segment today. And again, thank you all for sending in your questions. And again, thank you for your time, and all the best for the protests on the ground.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.